But this morning we are going to kick off with the summaries of the 3 breakout rooms we had yesterday. So we'll go with certificate transparency first, then binary transparency, and then a summary of the key transparency room. So first up for certificate transparency, I'd like to invite Joe to the stage.
Good morning, friends. So yesterday we had, I think, quite a productive breakout for CT. We started out with Devin leading a conversation on how we could adapt CT to a post-quantum age. The key observation here is that post-quantum algorithms are going to result in much larger keys and signatures. And our current approach to TLS has been to sprinkle signatures in essentially wherever it was convenient for us, including in CT. And so that results, if we naively swap in post-quantum algorithms for our existing algorithms, we're going to balloon substantially the size of the TLS handshake and also logs themselves, but by something like 8x, so pretty substantially. There are some knobs we can tune here, but all of them have some sort of size compromise. Like you can't get it for free. And this was combined with the expected significant reduction in certificate lifetimes is going to result in even more issuance for that logs are going to have to deal with. So a lot of this conversation was just like, how do we deal with that? There's a lot of uncertainty in the precise timelines for PQ, but the reality is that the web PKI is under a lot of pressure to start moving in the PQ direction right now from regulatory agencies, and there's critical mass there. And I think there's interest in making sure that we have a crisp story for CT, because the fear is if we don't have a crisp story for CT, that transparency could in fact be sacrificed at the altar of making TLS handshakes smaller. So it behooves us to think about this now, even though it's probably on the order of maybe 10 years out concern in terms of actually like needing post-quantum algorithms. We had some ideas that popped up that might help us to mitigate the impact on the handshake. For instance, that maybe transparency data doesn't actually need to be included in the handshake itself, but we could provide it out of band. And then, like, once we knew that a certificate was not included in a transparency log, we could interrupt the connection or something like that. Obviously, that's not without sacrifice, but it was a design space that was at least worth considering. The observation was made that the current shape of SCT auditing actually can be relatively straightforwardly adapted to check for certificate inclusion even without SCTs. So if you're willing to make the sacrifice of like initial connection, we have things that sort of look like what you'd have to do, but they're gross for various reasons otherwise. So while no brainwaves popped up for how to solve the challenge during the breakout, we did spend a lot of time identifying ways that we could mitigate the size impact for logs. Actually, we spent a ton of time in the breakout on that, both in the PQ portion of the conversation and in the portion that followed. The first big observation we had here is that if you're a log operator, your costs are dominated by consumers pulling down the contents of the logs, but that many consumers of CT logs in particular don't actually care about a lot of the data that's in the CT log, and also don't frankly trust the log. So they're not interested in verifying necessarily, and that there's an opportunity there for literally just adding like some read endpoints that let you pluck out just the data you were interested in, and on the theory that for a huge number of consumers, that could result in a dramatic reduction in the data that they would need to pull from the log, and they'd still be just as happy. So that's an interesting one for me personally, as someone who thinks about CT in today's terms, not just for a post-quantum transition, because that's something we could do now and get some benefit from too. So we briefly chatted about the impact of CT on of PQ on the size of the CT logs keys themselves. That got us off on a brief conversation about logistical challenges of log management and whether there was an opportunity to centralize and standardize log metadata to make it less labor intensive. One of the things I was complaining about in my talk yesterday was just like the amount of logistical overhead of dealing with logs coming up and coming down. So if there's a way we could sort of streamline that. Let's see. Had a bunch of good stories from the beginnings of CT, which is worth not reading out here, but was fun notwithstanding. There was a lot of discussion about what we could do if there was a dynamic that we could have where adding a CT log could reduce the burden in a meaningful way on the remaining CT logs. Because right now we have this property where if we add a log, it increases our redundancy, but there's enough cross-logging that it doesn't, like the life of other log operators doesn't get easier. And so how might you sort of play with that space? Obviously right now we do temporal sharding, but we could also do something like namespace sharding. So, the example from yesterday was .mobi domains are only going to get logged to these logs, and then dot whatever domains could be logged over there. Obviously, there's some work you have to do there to make sure that you load balance because .mobi is tiny versus some .com or something. But not necessarily. None of the ideas we came up with there, I think, were fully formed or brilliant ideas, but they're all. What we did do is identify a bunch of design spaces that are worth thinking about more. Let's see. After we finished the PQ brainstorming. Okay. In the same conversation, we also chatted a bit about other ways we could reduce storage space for logs, which is, for instance, coalescing common intermediate data across entries, which is a proposal that's been floating around in CT for a while, and I think its time has probably come. Let's see. Okay, we had a whole nother conversation about what does the world look like if we have a bunch more CT enforcing user agents, because we have that coordination overhead problem where Apple and Chrome and hopefully Android and Firefox and whoever else could all need to stay in line together. I think this conversation ended up being a little bit more straightforward because I think the reality is that this community is filled with people who want to do the right thing, and so there's a lot. It's a very strong incentive to sort of stay relatively well aligned, which doesn't make this problem easy, but it's of the challenges we face in transparency ecosystems. It's not actually the worst of them. Let's see what else. What else? We had a whole conversation. We had a lovely conversation at the end about auditing, SCT auditing, and whether the world is going a little bit more into depth on some of the topics that Lena was chatting about in her talk, and whether there were design changes we could make to the CT ecosystem that might facilitate better matching PIR schemes in the future, so that we could increase our coverage of SCT auditing. This is a little bit of a complicated space, and so I don't think we had any brilliant ideas there necessarily, but Lena reiterated the value of having dense indices which come from tiled logs being quite helpful for this space. That was an interesting conversation as well. And I'm probably forgetting something huge here as I scroll through the notes, but I think that's a pretty good overview of what we chatted about. So yeah. Actually, I've got 5 seconds. Is anyone who was there who's like, "Oh, Joe, you're forgetting something important"? Now's your chance to scream. It's like, "Oh, you fool! We also talked about X." No, all right, I'll take it.
Sounds like you covered it.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I did hear a lot of laughter coming from that room, so it sounded like you're all having fun. Okay, can I get Hayden up next to cover the binary transparency room? Thanks, Aidan.
William's also coming up because he took wonderful notes. Thank you, William. Let's see. So where we started with BT was trying to first find some commonality across it, because BT is an umbrella term. And very quickly, we realized that there are many different types of binary transparency projects. We discussed firmware transparency, signature transparency, system transparency. And to be honest, I don't know if we had any really concrete action items that came out of this, but it was a very enlightening discussion to see that there's just a lot of different forms here. And maybe at some point we'll find some commonality between these and find opportunities for alignment, whether it be due to schema or other parts of transparency. But yeah, I'm trying to think of specific ones. There was a lot of discussion around system transparency and runtime transparency as something that seemed an area where there's a lot more opportunity for exploration, and also something that was a combination of other transparency systems as well. There was some discussion around how can you combine what I think, William, you referred to as artifact transparency, which I think typically we're referring to as just binary transparency, with other parts of transparency ecosystems as well. We had some discussions on specific use cases. We tried to propose a set of claims. I don't know if we actually ended up proposing a set of claims, though.
I think there was consensus that the claim set should be, minimal, falsifiable per Al's sort of maxims around it.
And I think one very, very clear application was binary transparency within package registries. So we had some discussion on PyPI and got William's thoughts as well on that.
One log versus multiple. One thing we discussed was the relative importance of each ecosystem or each use case running its own log versus one sort of giant log to rule them all. And the trade-off we discussed there was, the operational complexity of running a log is going to go down over time, especially with these next generation logs. However, there's still going to be a wide range of community interest and technical ability behind, or that determines whether or not, for example, a smaller packaging ecosystem can stand up a log. And so one thing we discussed was, does it make sense? How do you authenticate to a log? Is there a difference between authenticating versus submitting a signed payload, et cetera? Those are things that we still need to, I think, sort of flesh out, but those were interesting.
We had some discussions around signature transparency, some discussions, again, around commonalities and differences. There was some discussions around data formats, around aligning on different types of schema. Again, I think the takeaway there is we have a few different approaches, and especially when you're looking at what is the intended use case, that's where some of these differences arise. And we'll just keep iterating on this, come back in a year, see where there's more commonalities and differences.
Yeah. I guess another prominent theme was the question of, so by default, almost everything we talk about is offline, but there's a question of how long do users actually expect an attestation or some commitment to actually live. And so there's a question of, does it make sense to have a time to live or similar piece of metadata somewhere encoded in the log? And there was lively discussion around that.
While we're looking, anyone else who was in the room, was there anything else that you wanted to call out? We got a good summary.
My handwriting is terrible, so he can't read it.
That's all right. My handwriting's terrible as well. Yeah, I feel like that was about it. Again, summarizing, we discussed a lot of different areas of binary transparency just because there really are a lot. And honestly, I think it's what makes it an exciting component of transparency, that there are so many different applications and use cases. And I suspect we're going to come back in a year and there will be even more possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, I guess one last thing I just remembered was we talked a little bit about the value of algorithmic diversity in the log. And so Sigstore goes one way, which is to say, the client has a set of algorithms that they support or suite they support. We should support those within reason. And then SIGSUM is the polar opposite, where we say, here's the one good suite we support, stick to that. And there's obvious trade-offs to both from the client side and from the application side or the server side. But it was a subject of discussion.
All right, so we go.
Great, thank you, Hayden and William, for trying to pin down a very nebulous space. That was a great summary. Okay, up next, I'll invite Jason to talk about the key transparency breakout.
That photo has real, action shot vibes. I don't know if the room was quite that exciting, but, I'll take it. So we had a good conversation with a mix of key transparency log operators, log auditors, and others interested in the space. So I want to say thank you to everyone who participated in the conversation, as I think it was a really good conversation and mix. We had a significant amount of discussion around the role of the auditor in key transparency systems and whether, given the size of logs, there functionally could be public auditing. I think folks in the room were surprised by how large these logs can get, particularly at for the end-to-end encrypted messaging case. And so we explored some ideas, including whether it'd be possible to audit arbitrary sections of the tree, or do things so you didn't have to pull down, large, keep thinking large and then go larger amounts of data. And really sort of honed in on this idea of auditor as important and sort of an unsolved part of the OWL. In the second session, we discussed some of the more user-facing components of key transparency. Part of this was about sort of you want to always enroll your keys in key transparency, and you want to have clients monitor themselves, but you may not want to always warn them, and you may want to make the warning be opt-in for a variety of reasons. And so trying to reason about that and how you reason about that across different use cases, as I think one of the things that was interesting that came up was I think we've talked a lot about key transparency in the end-to-end encrypted messaging or email case, but not necessarily so much in the machine identity case, where you have different set of users, different set of sort of failure conditions, and how you would want to warn in those instances. Talked a bit about where standards components or infrastructure would be useful. From the conversation, it seemed like implementation specific of each messaging platform makes leaf node data structures application specific, but there may be standardization around other data structures and things like witness protocols. We talked about how if you can get publishing epochs sufficiently small, you may actually be able to get away with getting rid of SCTs, SMTs, but that was sort of a how do we make the logs efficient discussion? Is that something that's still being worked on? And Filippo led us in a conversation around what could we build as a sort of tiny key transparency server for a small client, and what that might look like, and where I think there was sort of an interesting thought design of sort of taking what we know for big systems, how do we build a small efficient one? In terms of what folks wanted to take away from the summit for the key transparency session, can we find ways to drive down epoch size as a community to simplify the story? Auditing being required to complete the transparency solution, but it's hard to get the incentives right for a third party. And binary transparency in clients. This was considered key to completing the transparency solution, but it's not currently implemented on any of the existing platforms. And so, I think there was one point where sort of given that this has to be opt-in, given that you don't have auditors, there was sort of a discussion of is it worth it? And the answer was yes, because you mitigate a number of the risks. Can I say who said it's a good idea to kill the top 5 risks if you can? All right. So Bailey said, Chatham House rules. I want to respect that. Bailey made the point that if you can knock down the top 5 risks in your risk analysis, then it's worth doing, even if there's still tail risk that you can't converge on, which I thought was like a good message in terms of how to think about security privacy risks in general, and particularly this space where it's, in key transparency, things are new and evolving, and we know we are somewhere between the two circles and the owl, but exactly where I think is TBD. Folks in the room, is there anything that I'm missing? Okay. In that case, I'm going to hand it back to Tracy.
Thanks very much, Jason, for giving us those key takeaways. Okay, thank you very much to everybody who summarized those breakouts, especially because I know many people wanted to be in multiple places at the same time, and it was hard to choose, and you all chose well. All of them were very well attended, and lots of good discussions, and I had a lot of feedback from various people that it was really open, and they really appreciated the frank discussions that were happening. So thank you all.